morning, everybody. Thank you so much, specifically to John, for inviting me, and it's lovely to see such a good turnout. And thank you for the nice introduction. So I'm going to be talking about the subject it's my research area, it's also my hobby. I'm fascinated by this because I feel, and I've been working in this area for about 10 years, specifically on globalization, I feel that we're undergoing a major change as a global society that is equivalent to the Industrial Revolution. But we're in the middle of the change, and so it's difficult to understand the change because it's very deep and it's reaching into every aspect of our lives. My friends tell me things like, oh, I can't stand that my kids text at the table, things like this. But it's much more complex than all of that. And so I'm going to try just to hit on some of the major issues. I don't know if you're familiar with Anthony Giddens, but in 2003, he wrote a book, and one of my favorite quotes is, among all the changes going on in the world, none is more important than those happening in our personal lives, in sexuality, relationships, marriage, and the family. And so that's going to set the groundwork for what it is I'm going to be talking about today. So recently, in the last several years, there's been a lot of interest academically and programmatically in changing families and the role that families play in society. One of the biggest issues, however, is that the term family in a lot of places is stigmatized. Family is associated with a very traditional structure, where a heterosexual family with a male breadwinner, female homemaker, a couple of children, and in the United States you add the house with the white picket fence and a dog too. That's the image that family, that when you say family, that comes up. And I'll be talking more about it. The term in my mind has been very much co-opted and politicized also. However, that said, family is on people's minds. And there was a recent global survey of 27 countries and around 30,000 people. And they were asked about diversity, religion, gender, family. And they've all felt that, family and family ties were weakening, but that there was an overwhelming response that people would like to see family ties actually being strengthened and families being supported. So, like I said, what is family these days? And what do families need to sustain themselves? And I just want to say that I think there's a variety of things that has happened with the politicization of the term family. Some of it comes out of psychology, no offense to people who are psychologists, but it has to do with an individualistic focus. And some of it actually comes, and now I work on gender issues, I should just say that for the record, but comes also from the feminist movement because of, again, this association that family can be, quote unquote, bad for women because of sort of oppressive traditional gender roles. Accompanied with this politicization and debate around what is families, what is the role of the state, and how should states be supporting families? And then that spills over, of course, into programmatic issues. There is some consensus, however, and I'm an anthropologist, so I will tell you that people have lived in groups, however you define those groups, throughout humankind. We need each other. If we want to or not, we're dependent on each other. But it's dynamic. How we define the group and what the group does for us, that changes over time and across cultures. And families have always been changing. If you look historically, there has not been one family form. I actually became interested in this topic in graduate school when I read all the work by Good on sort of the North European family systems and how they changed. That was the beginning of all of this. Today we understand that this traditional quote-unquote family that I was talking about, that this is really a myth, and we live in many different types of families, and they're always evolving and responding to the larger context in which they live. So diversity is now embedded in the concept of family, and we're going to be talking about aging, because aging, I think, is a very important part of families. I know we're talking a lot about children and youth, but I actually think we really need to be looking at the life course and caretaking across the life course. So why do I say families still matter? And this actually came up at dinner last night, if families still matter or not. And I'm a big proponent that they absolutely do. Families do provide us with an initial sense of who we are, sort of personal and social identities. They still provide basic economic support, at least for dependent children, people who are ill, individuals with disabilities, and a certain number of older persons. And they're still the most efficient unit for raising children. There have been experiments throughout history for raising children in other settings, and none of those have worked. Actually, when I came to my university, there was still a course on the books called Emerging Lifestyles, and it was the idea, and this sort of dates me because it was a while back, but the idea of the course was that we were going to be living in all these new types of arrangements, communes and things like this. None of that has worked out. Yeah, we've actually moved away from those kind of models. So this is tied into the issue of globalization and the role of the state in supporting families. And one of the main consequences of globalization has been a move away by states from providing services for individuals, and instead, and this is happening globally, it is the role of the state has become the promotion of market economies. And you see this in Western and in non-Western countries. And so the state is actually moving away from its responsibility for education, health, and the welfare of individuals. We're seeing that around the world. Now, we see it particularly in the United States, but we're seeing it in other countries also, where this idea that the state should be providing all of these universal services for all the citizens of its society. That idea is very much up for debate these days. And so what is happening is that the health and well-being, particularly of children, those who are ill, older people, people with disabilities, somebody has to take care of them. Yeah? And so that's the question. Whose responsibility is this? So we are in a period of immense family change, and I just want to give you one example about that. In the United States, 50 years ago, people's life course was pretty clear, yeah? But you turned 20, 22, you married, marriage was your introduction to sexuality, and you were going to have children. And so most American adults by their mid-20s were married and had become parents. In 50 years, we have gone from 80% to 20% of families living with children under 18, and only 7% represent that quote-unquote traditional family that I mentioned at the beginning. We are seeing similar patterns, specifically in other high-income countries. Non-Western countries look somewhat different, and the Mediterranean countries like Greece also look somewhat different. So in the sort of high-income Western countries, the link between marriage and sexuality has broken down, and the whole institution of marriage has changed. Now, in Europe, cohabitation has really become, in many places, especially in the North European countries, an alternative for marriage. That's not true in the United States. In the United States, cohabitation is part of the route to marriage. So people meet, they date, they cohabit, usually for 1.5 or 2 years, they break up or they marry. So it's a somewhat divergent path. So what is happening with that is that marriage rates are falling. But by the way, what is very interesting is we keep talking about the fact that marriage is going away. Marriage isn't actually going away. It's just that people are taking longer to get married. And if you look across the OECD countries, you find that marriage is still the most popular form of partnership, despite cohabitation, despite people living alone and all that. But what is happening is we're waiting a lot longer to get married. I don't know if you realize, but in Sweden, which has the highest age of marriage, men are 35 at first marriage. So, and women about 33. The most profound change in terms of the age going up has been in Switzerland, where it's gone from 25 years in 1970 to being 32 when people get married. So what's happening is the life course is extending, basically, when we are doing things. And again, this is, I don't have my little clicker to show you, but you can see the dark blue dots. This is when people, this is the populations that used to get married, and now where people are getting married. So specifically, again, to the United States, social class plays a huge role. So in America, we have an incredible divide. I find it a very interesting divide. People who are educated and who have money, they marry, and they have their children within marriage. People who are less educated tend not to marry, and they tend to have their children outside of marriage. So the risk factors for children are very different dependent on social class. We're seeing the same trends in other countries, but America is the most extreme. And some sociologists have called this pattern from convergence, everybody is doing the same thing, to divergence. So we're creating our own path, our own life course path. Same with marriage, divorce rates are changing, but because fewer people are getting married, it affects the divorce rates. But what's happening is that there are more and more people living on their own, and they're living in non-traditional arrangements, also the sort of, being together, living apart, weekend relationships, all of this sort of thing. And by the way, in the United States, divorce rates have actually gone down. So in Europe, they've gone somewhat up, and in America, they've gone down. So again, just a graph to show you a little bit how things are changing. Like I said, the number of children being born outside of marriage is increasing. What is happening is the following. People are having children around 27, and they're marrying around 29. So it's a reversal of what used to happen. People used to marry earlier and then have their children. So we have flipped it. Marriage has become the culminating experience in the sort of relationship formation pattern. In Europe, the number of children born outside of marriage is about 33%. In the United States, it's 42%. And I travel a lot and speak in other countries. And I was in Qatar last year. And Qatar is a very traditional Islamic country. And I was showing some of these statistics, and the audience was just sitting there shaking their heads saying, how can this be? Whose name do the children get? They were completely flabbergasted by this idea that people are having children outside of marriage. I bring this up only because we in the West think that this is happening everywhere, and it's not. Yeah? These are some very Western phenomena. And it's when you go outside, I was in Japan also, when you go outside of where we live and you start having to, quote unquote, defend some of these statistics, it actually becomes quite complicated, so just something to think about. So again, just to show you a little bit sort of the increase in children being born outside of marriage, the dark blue triangles are from 1980, so. Fertility rate, as most of you in this room know, is going down across the whole OECD. Again, just to show you a little bit, nobody is at replacement level, pretty much, which is 2.1. In the United States, we are exactly at replacement level, but do you know why we're at replacement level? Immigration. So, because immigrants to the United States tend to have more children. But after one generation, that goes down also. So if you took immigration out of the mix, in the United States, white women are having about 1.6 children, so also not at replacement level. What I thought was very interesting, I don't know if you can see it, Ireland is actually at, I think I have a slide coming up on that. Ireland, you're still having a lot of children, so in comparison to everybody else. And John is going to be talking about this, so I'm very interested to hear. So again, just to give you a little bit of a feeling for what's going on in the European Union, so the prevalent pattern is to have no children or to have one child. That's the most common these days. So, and like I said, Ireland really stands out with respect to fertility, and I'll be interested to hear why that is, because it has the highest share of households with 3 or more children in the whole OECD. Yeah. So again, single person households are on the rise, and just in terms of definition, single person households are not considered a family. Again, to give you a little bit of a feeling for what is going on across Europe, you can sort of see the general, and I'll be happy if somebody wants these statistics, I'll be happy to send them to you, because I know it's difficult when you're just sitting in the audience. So the other thing that is happening is that the elderly, my next slide's about the elderly, that population is going up, but a very important piece for everybody in this room, particularly the practitioners, is that the people between the ages of 20 to 64 across the OECD countries are decreasing. That population is getting smaller. And why do we need to care about that? Because we need people who are working, and we need people who are involved in personal care for both young children and all types of dependents within families. And the prediction is by the OECD that by 2050, the demand for nurses and personal care workers is going to at least double. So we know that this sector is going to be growing. And so the students that we are training, we know they're going to have employment. The employment may not be well paid, but we know they have employment. So, like I said, a sort of historical first for our planet is the growing of the aging population. Look at the little figure just on the edge there between 1990 and what the prediction is by 2100. Europe, in terms of global perspective, Europe already has the greatest percentage of elderly people. And by 2050, the prediction is that in all areas of the world except Africa, a quarter or more of the population is going to be above 60. So the human population used to look like a pyramid, a lot of children born and fewer people at the top. Increasingly, it's looking like a rectangle. So, and we even have a situation in Germany in 2006, there were fewer children born than there were elderly people. So this is going to create complications in many different ways that we can discuss later. So what's also very interesting is that across the EU and the OECD countries, there are some trends that are happening, despite all the various differences. The positive news is there's been a decline in infant mortality. There's been, especially for people who are middle class and above, an increase in life expectancy and in educational attainment. We're all going to school more and longer. And by the way, we're pairing up based on our education. So whatever your last level of education is, that you're in all likelihood going to pair up with somebody who has that same educational level. And on a more depressing note, there's been an increase in child poverty across the EU and the OECD countries. And families with children are more likely these days to be poor than people who live on their own. So to sort of bring this all together, in the West, and America is leading the way with this, the family has shifted from being a coherent and dominant model of nuclear families formed early in life that included the introduction to sexuality and childbearing, to a system that is less prescribed, less uniform, and people have to make their own way. So what I'm trying to say with that is you used to know better how your life was going to look. These days, that's not true anymore. These days, we all are sort of muddling through it, figuring it out on our own. It's not prescribed anymore. When you enter education, for example, I don't know how it is in Ireland, but in the United States, lots of people, for example, go back to school in their 50s and 60s. All of this is shifting, like when you do things. It's not a straightforward path anymore. So I was asked to talk about predictions, and I just want to say for the record that social scientists are terrible at predictions. Yeah, most of our predictions don't turn out to be true, and the most famous one is by William Good, who in the 60s, he was a big sociologist, a lot of work on families was based on his stuff. He wrote, "There will be a general convergence to the conjugal family based on strong marital bonds and weaker bonds across generations and within lineages." Turned out he was completely wrong. Yeah. So I just sort of want to say that as we think about kind of what is going, we can sort of make general predictions, but there are many factors that we'll hit on still that make it very difficult to predict how things are really going to coalesce in the future. So why all of this change? Well, again, there's not a single answer to that. There are many things coming together. Economic changes, globalization, the way we're all tied to each other, the emphasis, like I was saying, on market economies all over the world, not just in the West, popular culture and the spread of popular culture. And I just, for the record, want to say, it's not like there's a real homogenization that is going on. There is a homogenization in terms of information sharing among certain social classes. So I was in New York at a dinner party, and people were like, but there were some people there from Singapore and somebody from Germany, and they were all talking about that they all had a Mercedes and they have a coffee maker, the same coffee maker. But this is not true when you get to poorer people, yeah, in different societies. They're not sharing in all of this sort of consumer, buying same consumer goods, shared music, and all of that. Social movements, migration, as we know, technology, family policy, all of this comes together and is creating family change. However, based on my research, the single strongest driver of family change, this is just my opinion, you can argue with me about it, is the economic self-sufficiency of women. And this is, again, not just happening in Western, but also in non-Western countries. Because by becoming economically independent, women can now choose when they partner up, if they want to stay in the relationship, and if they want to leave the relationship. And this is particularly the case when you start looking at non-Western societies and when you start looking at poor women who have, there's a lot of debate about industrialization and, women working in factories in places like Bangladesh and India and all that. But there's a flip side to the sort of exploitative argument, which is it's also given women the opportunity to earn an income and to get out of some of the oppressive systems in which they are. So it's never an easy argument. There's multiple sides to all of this. So, and again, when you look at the OECD, you see the numbers have been going up. There was a slight dip around 2008, 2009, but the numbers pretty much are high. So, and that's in the United States also. And if women aren't working full-time, they're working part-time. In the United States, working part-time is a very bad deal. You don't get any benefits. You get paid by the hour and all that. In many European countries, the European countries are moving in a good direction with part-time work in terms of benefits and all of that sort of thing. So again, just to give you a little bit of an idea of the extent to which women are in the labor market in paid employment. I just want to make clear paid employment. So these days, when people are coupled up, most people are dual earner families. When we talk about family change and how to support families, we really need to keep that in mind, because a big problem in my mind is our systems are predicated on the idea that there's one person at home and one person who's working. I'll give you a personal example. I have 12-year-old twins, and the school wants to see me at 11:30 during the day when I'm in my office always. Things like that. The systems don't speak to each other these days. So what's happening is that as more and more women are in the paid labor force, men get a bad rap because it always sounds like they're not helping and not working, but actually men, especially among the younger generations, they're all helping these days, to specifically around the house and with childcare. Not as much maybe as everybody wants, but it is going up. So that said, again, there's a lot of cultural variation, and there's a lot of variation across socioeconomic class and with educational levels. So higher educated couples tend to have these more egalitarian relationships. Among working class and poorer couples, that's not necessarily the case. Some of it having to do with very complicated issues around, how do you define masculinity, and is masculinity tied into breadwinning and all of this sort of thing. So all of that said, in OECD countries, women still spend about 2 more hours on unpaid domestic work than men do. But like I said, men really have been much more involved than they were even 20 years ago. So a central driver, I think we talk too much about families from the sort of emotional, sympathetic sort of perspective, but really families are driven by economics, and family change is driven a lot by economics. And the core in all of this is the work care spectrum, and it affects every family in every culture across the socioeconomic spectrum. So very poor families, they're struggling. Yeah, they're working multiple jobs, or they're trying to find work, whatever, and they somehow have to care for the members of whoever lives with them. But even very high income families struggle with this, because these days through technology, everybody is all the time tied to their work. So those families deal with the high intensity of work. So work-family care or work-individual care, it affects everybody these days. And of course, when people don't have money, don't have jobs, when they live in extreme poverty, this very much affects child outcomes and, violence and all of these sort of things, and has a long-term effect. And again, something I think we need to be thinking about when we talk about poverty is that child poverty is different from adult poverty, because child poverty really influences the whole life course of the children. We have rising inequality across European countries, across the OECD, and particularly in the United States. So, there's this increasing gap economically, but like I said, the gap is also tied socially. So, and that's what's very important to us. So, and the inequality affects not just family life, it doesn't just affect individual life, it also tears at the bonds of society, because when there's great inequality, people start trusting institutions. Yeah, and that leads to social unrest. So this is, I think, something that as a whole I keep hearing people ask me about the political situation in the United States. We've been talking about political situation here in Europe, but I think some of the explanation is found in this issue of inequality and different individuals, different groups having very different experiences within the same society. We're not all living the same lives, and I think we sometimes forget that. So why do we need to care about family change? Well, the old model was that family change occurred internally. There were stressors in the family, and this led, for example, to divorce or whatever. But the reality is that we're embedded in larger social systems, and these days we understand that. And so we need to contextualize children, individuals, families within the larger context in which these things are happening. And the second thing that is happening is, I was talking about sort of this divergence. What is happening is increasingly there's a hybridization going on. So we're getting pieces from different places through globalization, through social media, and then we create our own new mishmash of what we think is traditional for us. But there's nothing fixed anymore. We used to think, this is how you live your life, these are our customs, these are our traditions. But it's all on the move these days, and that is all part, I think, of globalization. So, and then we still have myths that we deal around. So, like I said, we deal with this myth of globalization, that there's this homogenization that is going on, and that people in China and in Nigeria and in Ireland, are facing the same problems. They may be facing some of the same problems, but in all likelihood, they're facing different problems, and within the society, there are different reactions to what is going on. I keep having this argument with people who tell me that families don't matter anymore, it's all about the individual. That's not true, particularly for low-income people. That is not true for people who do not come from Western societies. For them, family really, really matters. And I would argue that even in the West, family to some extent still matters for most people. We're living in this sort of time, like Becker said, that, everybody has choice. Choice is very much related to money and the way you live. Yeah, not everybody has all of this choice, and not everything in our lives is up for negotiation. So some of it is cultural and some of it is economic. And then we have this idea that specifically women are better off now. Yes, women have more educational opportunities, they have more occupational opportunities, but again, the research shows that, women face other issues than men do, and the issues are different in Western and non-Western societies, and they differ by social class. So again, just sort of to keep that in mind. So how do we best adapt our social programs and our policies? I think the first is exactly like what you're doing, which is moving towards holistic family support across the life course. That not just targeting children or youth or elderly, but kind of looking at it from a more group perspective. So the systems perspective, in my opinion, is key. I worked for 6 years on a research project on comprehensive family support across the United States, and it was really interesting. The organizations that did best were organizations that really had that systemic, broader perspective, and they partnered. There were these interesting collaborations, kind of like what we were talking about. These collaborations, different organizations would bring different strengths to the table and would partner up and then deliver an array of services. That worked better. That's what we found anyway in our study, worked better than anything else. Also, we need to really keep in mind cultural and regional differences. I was just in Barcelona last week, and it really struck me. I had been to Madrid, and I thought, it's going to be just like Madrid. It wasn't. It was very different. It was very, very regional. And we need to understand that. Religion plays an important role. In the West, we've kind of moved towards this secularity, but when you leave the West, when you go to other places, religion plays a huge role in people's lives. And again, even in places like the United States, there's a large population where religion is a primary, if not the primary factor in people's lives. And we tend to ignore that, especially as social scientists. Of course, public policies that you already know. And then I think it's very important that we look at educational and occupational opportunities for young people. We have about 1.8 billion young people around the world. Most of those young people don't have any opportunities. There are very few opportunities. This is going to create new problems for us. So, because, for example, when a young person doesn't have a job, they can't think about partnering up and forming a family. There's many issues that come from that. So, some recommendations, I've divided them up for different groups. So, for academics, I think that we need more of. I'm just delighted to learn about your program here. Your program here matches exactly the program that we have at Delaware in terms of child, youth, and family support. We do exactly the same thing. I think we need more of these programs around the world. So we need more family-focused research that emphasizes culture and cultural context. This is best done, in my mind, through interdisciplinary research teams. And I work a lot with the United Nations, and one of the things I've learned is there's very little data. Yeah, we have very little data about what's actually going on around the world, and it's very difficult to make policy recommendations or program recommendations if you don't have data. And this is particularly problematic in low-income countries because it's not a priority for them to gather data because there's so many other issues that are on the table. And then we also need more help in terms of rights-based curricula, human rights-based curricula, I think, and with a gender focus for both men and women. In terms of the work care spectrum that I was talking about, we know that parental leave, childcare services, child benefits, these are the policies there that work. There's a brand new report out from UNICEF today, came out today, and it is an evaluation of what countries in Europe have the most family-friendly policies. And what's the most interesting thing about that report is that no country is perfect. Every country, including the North European countries that we hold up as the standard, as the gold standard, every country has issues around family policies. They're just different in different countries. So I think we need a lot more dialogue, and we need to be discussing it with each other. So social protection policies need to be aligned with family support, and there's a lot of areas I think we need to consider: health, child protection, early childhood education, education in general. I think it's excellent that we focus on early childhood, but youth also need they need after-school programming, and they need training to prepare them for the skills-based work that they are going to need to survive. Housing, I've been working on housing. I knew very little about housing, and I don't know if you realize this, in the last 5 years, there's been a globalization of housing. There's not enough housing around the world, including in low-income countries, because there are these real estate corporations that are buying up whole areas, including areas that were considered quote-unquote undesirable. They're buying them all up and either saving them or turning them into resorts or turning them into high-income housing areas. We don't have enough housing. It's a huge problem in the United States, it's a problem in Europe, and it's a growing problem, and it's going to become more of a problem as people age and they need more units, smaller units to be living in. And then the issue of food security. So in terms of family support, I think we don't just need intervention approaches, we really should be talking about prevention. And as I was saying, we should be incorporating a sort of holistic life cycle approach. So for example, I just want to give you one example about this. It comes from the Netherlands, where people are allowed to save money that they put into a fund so that if they need to take leave in the future, they can, and there's a fund there. So, or they can also fund somebody else providing care, not just the traditional mom and dad, but somebody else who they consider family to help with care of either older people or children or whoever. So. And then there's job sharing, part-time retirement schemes. All of these are ways in which we can support families better through these changes. Also, we don't talk enough, I think, about technology. We do not know how artificial intelligence, which is supposed to be the next 10 years, is going to be very revolutionary. We don't know how that's going to be affecting us, but there are many ways in which technology can these days be used for family support, including for real-time monitoring, social networks, that sort of thing. Two-generation approaches are becoming more common globally. What that means is you don't just focus on the child, you focus on the child and the caregiver or parent in terms of creating programs or supports for the family. Why should all of this matter? Well, the next generation is experiencing a very different world than us. And one of the things that I think is most important about globalization is that it's happening very quickly. Things are happening faster and faster. I have myself children, and it is really interesting for me to see the way they're dealing with, I'll give you an example, when there's a problem, well, they go on YouTube and find it directly. It never occurs to me to go on YouTube to solve my problems, So it just, there's things that are happening, but very quickly, and they're changing faster and faster. This is a problem because we have a lot of people who are being left behind in all of this. Not everybody has access to all of this information that we have. I've been working with some colleagues in Greece around refugee issues, And when you hear what goes on, for example, in the refugee camps, where the young people have no access to education, not enough access to technology, these are very problematic issues because they're going to affect the world as we move forward. And there's a certain denial of human rights that is now going on by excluding whole parts of populations. And I just want to say, I realize how complex all of this is, but I just think we need to be tackling all of this. And my last slide, and I just want to say, it's only through a systemic, family-focused approach that we can reach the most vulnerable individuals and families worldwide and assist them in realizing their rights and full potential. Thank you.